Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mike Babin, and I'm the president of the Hong Kong Veterans Commemorative Association. And my father, Alfred Babin, was a Hong Kong veteran. I'm proud to be his son. So welcome to our event this evening. The topic is The Dark Side of the Sun, presented by Michael Palmer. And we'll get to Michael in a couple of moments, but just a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, I think you're probably mostly aware of how these events run. Your camera is not on, and neither is your microphone. And we will be taking questions, and you can ask your questions actually at any time during the presentation, just by typing them in. You'll see a button marked Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and you can simply press on that and type in your question. We will hold your questions until the end of the presentation, and then Michael will answer your questions. One thing that we've added in our more recent events, for people like me who have a little bit of trouble hearing, we do have closed captioning available. And you can find that at the bottom of your screen. There's a button that should be marked CC for closed captioning. And if you click on that, you'll find that there are computer-generated closed captions available to you. Now, these captions are not always perfect. They are generated by computer, but I think you'll find them useful if you need them. Now, please note that we are recording this event, and the event and the recording of the event will be available starting tomorrow. So you can rewatch it if you like, or you can pass it along to your friends and family who were not able to attend. And those recordings also have closed captions should you need them. So tonight's presenter is Michael Palmer. Michael is a maritimer, having been born in Antigonish, Nova Scotia, with roots in Prince Edward Island. And Michael currently lives and works in Calgary in the oil and gas industry, but has an eclectic background. He's been a world traveler, both before his family arrived and with his family. He's an avid music fan, a history buff, and an author of both fiction and nonfiction books. In one of his books, The Dark Side of the Sun, Michael tells the story of his grandfather, George Palmer, and his experiences in Canada's Sea Force. And we're going to hear about George Palmer this evening. So Michael, let me turn it over to you.
Hi, Mike. Yeah, thanks for that introduction. I really appreciate that. Very nice. Thanks for getting in touch with me to put on this presentation. And thanks to everyone who have joined us here. It's quite a story to tell, not just my own grandfather, but all those men and women who were over there in Hong Kong during World War II. I have endless respect for those people, for sure. After all the years that I've done my research, I'm still amazed at how a lot of them made it back home. It's quite a story of survival. I think at this point, I'll kind of talk about this in sections, and I'll start off with basically an introduction about myself and how I get into this whole hobby of researching war and that type of stuff, and the whole Hong Kong story. So growing up, I was an avid reader, and my father had a lot of war books, but I never really was interested much in that topic and in that area. Although I knew that my grandfather had been a war veteran, or that he was a war veteran, and that he had fought in Hong Kong, but I never got too interested in it early on in my life. But then I came across a book, and a war book, probably when I was in junior high. And I'm going to toggle this back and forth between my presentation here. I'll share the screen. There, so now it's on the PowerPoint. So hopefully you can see that. Oh wait, now I gotta click the button here, share. So yeah, so this book here, Green Beach. This is one of the first books I picked up about the war, World War II. And it kind of got me really interested in the whole war era. And this book was quite fascinating. I'll just mention a little blurb on it. And the big thing about this book, it was about this fellow who was a radar specialist, and it was actually part of the Dieppe raid, the Canadian raid on France in Dieppe. And he was supposed to go with the other men and land at Dieppe. And his role, this one man, this radar specialist, was supposed to make his way up to a radar installation and actually steal some radar plans from the Germans and then bring them back to England. And but the most interesting part of this whole story is that he had a contingent of bodyguards with him, 5 or 6 soldiers who were going to protect him. But then on the flip side, if they were going to be captured, they're supposed to kill him. So I don't know. I don't know how you define courage, but this has to be it because it was volunteer. He actually volunteered for this. So if you can imagine going ashore and all these guys around you who you've kind of developed a bit of a closeness to were also supposed to kill you if you were to get captured because he had so many secrets and all that within himself. Anyway, so this book really set it off for me, and it got me thinking about the war, and it got me into other books. And then I was almost obsessed with the whole war era. And then that got me into my grandfather's whole journey. And then, but even then, I wrote this book called Dark Side of the Sun, but I wrote it much later on in life. And I started thinking about my grandfather passed away in 1991 when I was 21. So I knew him for 21 years of my life. But I really didn't get into the specifics of his journey until I was about 30. And that's when I started thinking about maybe piecing together his journey after he had passed away. And so just more or less for our own family members. So I started uncovering, different pieces here and there about his journey. I came across old interviews involving him, and it was just, and I came across some historians and some old friends of his, Hong Kong veterans who knew him, who were over there, and it was just I was able to piece it all together, and I came up with Dark Side of the Sun, this book, but it was only meant for family, and I made a bunch of copies for family, and I thought that was kind of the end of it, and then lo and behold, a publisher got wind of it, and they got a hold of me, and they said, we'd like to publish this story, and would you be interested in signing a contract and so forth? And I was quite amazed that anyone would contact me for this, and I had definitely wasn't that wasn't part of what I was thinking of, but I was happy with that, and I certainly signed with them, and that's how my book got published. And that was around 2010. So yeah, that was that was a really an interesting journey for me, and also to get the story of the Hong Kong men out there, including my grandfather, of course. Um, so that's how it all kind of evolved for me, and I'll just kind of get into the actual story, the Hong Kong story of my grandfather, but I'm going to also overlap, maybe some of the big picture as well, as I work along with the story of my grandfather. So, to talk about my grandfather, I'm gonna have to go way back, and I'll go back to 1909, March 6th, and that's when George was born. So he was born in New Brunswick, and his name was William Palmer. His father, when George was 4, his father actually went out west on a harvest excursion, and which wasn't uncommon for some men back then. They could make a lot of money going out west for a season, and but on one of these excursions, he actually never came back. So it's a bit of a mystery as to what happened there, but he never came back east. So now George was without a father. So his mom took him, and they moved to PEI. That's where she had grown up, and her name was Mary Ellen Steele. And so that's how they kind of ended up back in PEI. She had relatives there, and in a place called McCaskill River, and which is more on the eastern side of Prince Edward Island. And so now George is kind of getting into his, teenage years and so forth, and he's attending school. And then after school, he's now getting into different types of work. He started off in a store, And then you get into labor type of work, farmer, fisherman. He ended up in some forest camps. He ended up on the apple harvest over in Nova Scotia. So he kind of bounced around quite a bit depending upon the season. Now, as bad as it was that his father had left and didn't come back, and his mother, Mary Ellen, actually passed away, and she had just gotten remarried, I think back in the late 1920s or early 1930s. So then, yeah, she ends up passing away, I think from a disease of some sort. And so now he's on his own, and he's got no siblings. So he's kind of going through a pretty rough life, but he's a hardy soul. All these experiences have really kind of made him kind of a hardy individual, which would serve him well, whenever he was going to be sent off to Hong Kong with what he was going to go through. So I'll bring up this again. Hopefully this will be okay this time. So I'll share my screen. I'll just show a few more pictures. So I'll talk and then I'll share some pictures and toggle back and forth that way. All right, share. So here we go. So here's a picture of George. That's him in the back, standing. He's got a big head of hair. So he's a tough, strapping young man. That would have been probably in the 1920s, and he was at a wedding during this picture. Now we'll get into the war type details, but I'll just start off with this picture, and then I'll get into his journey into getting into the army. So that's George on the right, and that's his friend Graham Boudreau on the left. And it's a nice picture. What really strikes me with this picture is how young Graham looks. Like he went to Hong Kong as well, and he looks like he's 15. These men were pretty young. Now, I think the average age of the Hong Kong veterans were, I think, early 20s, 22, 23 or something. When my grandfather went over, he was about 30 or 31. So he was a little bit older than the other men. And that, I think, also helped him. It served him well as well through all the ordeals he had to go through. Just, he was had a bit more maturity, being an older man, working through all these things. Okay, so I'm going to see if I can do this right this time. So I'll stop share. Okay, I think that's good. I think we're back to the other screen. So now we're at the late 1930s. So 1939, the war begins. Germany invades Poland, September 1st. So a few days later, Britain declares war on Germany. So now all of a sudden, all the colonies, all the Britain's colonies are now looking for men to sign up. So George does. He signs up in Kent, Nova Scotia. So I suspect he was probably on an apple harvest, or he was in during a lumbering stint over in Nova Scotia. But that's when he volunteered in 1940, February. And he wasn't a military man, of course. He was just someone who got caught up in the war. At the time, he was probably looking for a big adventure, like a lot of those men. He wanted to probably go overseas and, kind of enjoy himself a little bit, have some adventure. And I suspect that's what he was going for. So he volunteered for active service. He was transferred to the Royal Rifles unit. And as I'm sure everyone knows, the two units that went to Hong Kong were the Royal Rifles and the Winnipeg Grenadiers. So then he transferred to the Royal Rifles in November of 1940. And then for the next 9 months, those men in the Rifles, they ended up being sent, I guess it would have been overseas to Newfoundland, because Newfoundland wasn't part of Canada at that point. So going to Newfoundland was actually serving overseas. So they were sent to Newfoundland, to Gander and Botwood, and even a little bit of time at St. John's, mainly for coastal defense and training. So it was kind of like garrison type duties. So they weren't really going into active combat, of course. It was more garrison type duties. And then around the summer of 1941, the men all came back to Valcartier in Quebec for more coastal defense duties at St. John, New Brunswick. And it was around this time when, of course, decisions were being made by the people in power. Winston Churchill, the Canadian Prime Minister, and these fellows, the Chief of Staff, on what to do if Japan goes to war. Because now, at this point in time, in the bigger picture, Japan is heavily engaged in their battles in China, and they need oil and a lot of material, and they aren't getting it. So, and they need more oil to continue with their war machine. And so the Americans and the Japanese are getting involved in a big bout. Then the Americans slap an embargo on them, so they can't get oil. So, of course, the Japanese, in their minds, have no other choice but to declare war against the Americans, against the Allies, so that they can then sail south and take over land that are heavy with oil. So the West Indies, Indonesia, Southeast Asia area. And of course, that's what happens. They declare war. But before this, the Hong Kong garrison, so yeah, decisions were made to send these 2 units over to Hong Kong. And the men, it was done in haste. It was quick, and the men didn't have much time to get ready. But they got prepared, sent on the trains across Canada, made their way to Vancouver. And then from there, they sailed on 2 ships, the Awatia and the Prince Robert. And they arrived in Honolulu, Hawaii around November 2nd, 1941. And then they went on to Manila to refuel. And during these times, they didn't know where they were actually going. There was rumors, but they really did not know. And I think it wasn't until between Hawaii and Manila, where they actually notified officially that it was going to be Hong Kong. So I'm sure, again, at this point, it was all a big adventure for all these guys. And, they would land in Hong Kong around November 16th. But sadly, they had another ship with all their vehicles and probably some guns too. And that ship never arrived, because then war broke out a few weeks later, and those ships with that equipment got diverted elsewhere. So the men, were basically there defending Hong Kong without any major gunnery. They had their own guns, but I mean, they were going to be facing, a Japanese division that was, fully armored. But in the meantime, they arrived in Hong Kong and they enjoyed themselves for 3 weeks. It was, from a lot of the transcripts that I've read and diaries, it was a beautiful time to be there. They really enjoyed themselves. They went out at night often, drinking beer and having some fun and enjoying the nightlife, and really enjoying the weather. They had their own servants there that would, shave with them in the morning and all that type of thing. So they were really treated well, and they lived in these barracks. It was called Chamchapo Camp barracks, and very nice barracks, and they were just enjoying the life. But only miles away, the Japanese were on the border of Hong Kong, sharpening the knives, just waiting for the signal to invade. But of course, no one really knew when or if they were going to, and so forth. So I'll just toggle back now and just show a few more pictures. Okay. There, I think I'm getting better at this. All right, so that's George and Graham. And let's see. So that's the Lady Drake. That was one of the ships that took the man from Newfoundland back to Valcartier. That's George and Jeanette just before before he left on the train to go to Hong Kong. And these are all the men waiting. This is kind of a very popular photo. I've seen this photo a lot, but it really shows, all the men there waiting at Valcartier, waiting to get on the train to head west. And they had no idea, of course, what was ahead of them. Those are some dog tags from my grandfather, George. That's the Awatia. So that was the main troop ship that took most of the men across the Pacific. And then I believe there was also a group that went on the Prince Robert. And there was the Prince Robert. That was kind of their escort ship. And there are the men. They are leaving their ship at Hong Kong and getting their legs under them after being on the ocean for a few weeks. And there they are. They're marching up the street in Hong Kong, heading towards their new accommodations at Shamshipo. And this is their some of these guys are training. So they had 3 weeks in Hong Kong. And again, they had no idea, what was going to happen, when things could happen. And so in the meantime, they, aside from the nightlife, they were also involved in training. And Hong Kong is a very hilly colony, island. As you can see in the background here, some more Canadians training. It's a very hilly topography, and something that they probably weren't really used to. They weren't used to the climate. They only had a few weeks to get used to all these new things. The Asian cuisines, the Asian foods. The hilly areas, the climate. And 3 weeks, they just did not have a whole lot of time or enough time to get used to all that. Okay, now I'm just going to go back. I'll take a look. Okay, I'll swing back again. All right. So the men are enjoying themselves, but December 7th comes along and Pearl Harbor gets attacked. War is declared. On that same day, well, the Japanese, they start invading different areas, one of them being Hong Kong. So they invade, and not from the ocean, of course, they invade overland into Kowloon and the new territories. So if for some of you who might not know the land, there's a mainland part to the colony, and then there's the Hong Kong island. So they invade overland, and they start pushing the men. And it wasn't, and I should mention this, it wasn't just the Canadians who were defending Hong Kong. There was also British units, and there's even a Scottish contingent, and there was also some units from India, and there was also the Hong Kong home volunteer group. There was about 14,000 men in total defending Hong Kong. And so the Japanese, on the other hand, it was the 38th Division, and these guys are rugged. They're fresh from battles in China, and they've been battling in China for years. So they knew they'd been to war. They were fast on their feet. They didn't need much. These Japanese, they carried their rice and everything with them. They were very mobile. It took the defenders totally off guard. They were totally unprepared for these Japanese who were coming in and were very efficient as far as war comes. And plus, they had the big guns. They have big guns, lots of artillery. They have an air force coming in. Whereas the defenders, including the Canadians, they didn't have. I think they had one destroyer, an old, outdated destroyer. And of course, their other ship that had all their vehicles and such didn't make it. It got diverted. And they only had 2 or 3, I think, World War I planes left as defense. And they were all shot up in the first day when the Japanese invaded. So the men were heavily outgunned, heavily outmanned, and against, the Japanese who were fresh from battles in China. So the fact that they even lasted a few weeks in these battles is very surprising, but these men were determined to defend, Hong Kong. So although it didn't take long for the Japanese to kind of push them out of the mainland. I think it was, so they invaded around December 7th, 8th. And then by the 13th of December, the Japanese had pushed the last of the men off the mainland. So now everyone was on the island. Just going to grab a drink of water here. So from about the 13th to the 18th, it's now a siege. So, the Japanese are coming forth with surrendering documents, and of course the defenders are saying, no, we're going to fight this out. And so the Japanese lay a siege on Hong Kong Island for another 4 or 5 days, bombing Hong Kong Island. And then on the 18th, they actually invade. So they come across Victoria Harbor, which is about 1 or 2 kilometers wide. And then they invade on the area, about a 3-kilometer beachhead. And I'll bring up the next few slides here. All right. So the gist of the battle, and again, I'm not a military expert, that's for sure, but I'll just kind of describe the gist of it. So in general, they came across Victoria Harbor up the top here, and they kind of started driving a wedge right down the middle. And as they were driving this wedge down the middle, they were starting to fan out east and west. So this effectively just kind of broke up, the defenders into 2 groups, and within a day or two, the whole middle was taken by the Japanese, and both sides could not swing back and forth anymore. They were kind of isolated on each side of the island. Now, my grandfather, during this time, I'll explain what my grandfather kind of went through during this battle. So here's another picture of the Hong Kong island. So my grandfather, he was in this area here where this green oval is, and that's called Mount Parker. And Mount Parker was one of the highest peaks on the island. And so it was a very strategic point to keep. And so the Japanese were wanting to take on that peak, and the Hong Kong veterans, they were wanting to defend it. So a lot of heavy battles happened in this Mount Parker area. So my grandfather, he was heavily involved in these skirmishes. And but over time, the Japanese they were coming at them with overwhelming numbers and overwhelming guns, that sort of thing. And so the men were, falling back bit by bit. So at some point, there were quite a few wounded in my grandfather's unit. And at some point, they had to get these guys to a hospital. So they uncovered a truck, and then they loaded up the wounded. And then I think a few of the guys got in the front as well. And my grandfather actually drove the truck. So he jumped in, drove it, and he kind of drove it through the center of the island, kind of right around here, or in the center road. And it was around this time that the Japanese had just started making inroads into this area, because as they were driving along in the truck, they actually encountered some Japanese resting on the sides of the roads. And the Japanese didn't even realize it was the enemy for them until, my grandfather was kind of driving through them. And then of course, when they finally realized it wasn't a Japanese truck, my grandfather hit the gas and, took off and made it through. But they did fire, and they actually wounded some others as they drove through that hotspot. And my grandfather, who was actually shot in the leg as he was driving, so he was now wounded too. So they ended up driving westward, and they made it to this area where there was that red circle, and that was St. Albert's convent, which of course was a convent, but they've converted it to a hospital during this battle. So now the men are there, and it's around the 19th of December, so about a day or so after the Japanese had invaded. And it was around this time that, or at this point, they stayed there for the next few days. And then by the 23rd, the Japanese were closing in on that hospital and that whole area. And then they surrendered. They had to surrender, sadly. And but it was an interesting moment of that surrender, because my grandfather, he was actually manning a position. So he wasn't, I think he could still man a position. He had a leg injury, but I think it was more superficial wound. So he was actually manning a position outside of the hospital, and they were all desperate for rest and sleep because they've been fighting for days. And so they were all sleeping, and there was one guy that was supposed to stay guard, and he ended up falling asleep. So before long, they all woke up to the sounds of Japanese voices all around them, and that's how they ended up surrendering their unit. So yeah, it's in a way maybe that was a good thing because my grandfather was he was headstrong, so he probably wouldn't have gone down without a fight. So that might have saved him and probably the other men. So now they've now been captured. Okay, so I'm going to, oh yeah, here's just a few other pictures. Some Japanese here. They've got the big guns, um, shooting off during the battle. And yeah, they're very mechanized too. And here's some more Japanese coming across a bridge, and again, I'm behind, very hilly. So it was a battle on the hills. Most of the island was just hills. Some men said they didn't know when they were retreating or when they were pushing forward. It was just a very confusing, chaotic battle on that island. Okay, I'll get to that one next. Okay, so at this point, we're at about December 23rd. And the battle is starting to wind down. And, the men were hoping that the British would be coming to save them, at least get them off the island, if they couldn't back them up with extra soldiers. But the British didn't have any extra ships. They were busy fighting Hitler and they were busy fighting in Europe. So there was no help for these guys. And I think they realized this near the end, that there was no help coming. And if we kept this battle going, it's just more of a slaughter, because a lot of men were dying, and there was a lot of brutalities by the Japanese soldiers on the men, on certain men, and now that they've become prisoners. And also patients in hospitals. Some of the Japanese come into these hospitals and bayoneted some of the patients. Some, it depended upon the unit that you engaged in. Some of the Japanese were fairly commonsensical, but there were other units that were not. So they finally decided to surrender on December. So December 25th, on Christmas Day in 1941, which I think they call it Black Christmas in Hong Kong now, or back then they called it the Black Christmas. So the battle ends, and it was a horrendous battle, chaotic. There was a lot of hunger and thirst, because once the men were backed onto the island, they didn't have any food reserves. And so they were just basically surviving on whatever they could scrounge up. And the sleepless, they couldn't sleep because there was no reinforcements. So they were fighting all the time, and a lot of men were starting to falling asleep. So it was a very horrendous ordeal. And also thirst, because the Japanese at this point, by the 23rd to 24th, they'd actually cut off the water supply. So even getting water was tough. And there's confusion, there was terror, because the men knew, they heard of stories from China in the previous battles, what the Japanese have done to prisoners and to the Chinese civilians. So they knew what could potentially be coming at them, a lot of brutalities. At this point, the battle ends. The men now become prisoners. And this is the next chapter of this whole journey. Their prisoner of war life begins. Now, in Hong Kong, right after the war, or after the battle, the men were sent to North Point. And North Point was actually where the Japanese had landed on the island. So that whole area, it was actually a camp. There was an immigrant camp that had been built there before the war. And so it housed immigrants and so forth. Well, that was all fairly gutted because of the battle. That's where the Japanese landed. So there's a lot of battle there. But they brought them in, and they told them they had to stay in this camp for now. So the men had to kind of fix it up themselves. The Japanese left it to their own devices. And I'll kind of talk about North Point and Shamshipo Camp I'll talk about the conditions at the same time because both were kind of the same as far as conditions. It's just that Shamshipo was on the mainland, across Victoria Harbor, and the men would end up going there after a few months of being at North Point. So both camps were horrendous. The buildings were all, torn to shreds from the battle. So they barely had a roof over their heads. There was no heat, there was no medical facilities. They had to kind of create their own medical facility, which, lacking pretty much everything, they did the best they could. But there were dead bodies strewn about. So they had to get men involved to, get these bodies into a certain area because of the stench and disease and that sort of thing. um, the food. Now, the food, of course, had to feed them. The Japanese weren't expecting to take many prisoners because they themselves didn't believe in surrendering. So it's all part of this Bushido complex that the Japanese had, where they didn't believe in surrendering. They thought you would fight to the death. So to them, it was quite a surprise that all of a sudden they had all these prisoners to take care of. So they just kind of, although they guarded them, they kind of left the men up to their own devices. Although they gave them food, mainly rice. It was a starvation diet, and the rice. I mean, the rice was very low grade, of course. It was. I heard stories that it was just rice from warehouses, rice from the floor that they would just sweep up, and there was, cigarette butts in them, and just there was maggots and just horrendous stuff. But what could the men do? The men had to survive. So they got together. They created a kind of a kitchen facility as much as they could, but they would use hubcaps for plates, and they would do the best they could with the rice to make it edible. Um, and at the same time, it was Hong Kong, although it's warm, it can also get a bit chilly in the wintertime. So they would end up taking every second board, every second piece of timber from the wall and the ceilings within the barracks that they were now living in. So they did anything they could to try to survive. And that's what they had to do. And they covered up the doors and the windows as much as they could because they were all blown out from the battles and so forth. And so they did what they could, and they helped each other. I mean, that was critical for these men to help each other. And again, my grandfather being involved in all this, he was the kind of guy that he was a bit of a joker. He liked to joke around, and I know some of the guys who were there with him mentioned that he did often joke around to try to keep the morale up. He was that kind of a guy, which he was always there to kind of help out with morale. And plus, because he had worked in labor jobs and heavy labor, fishing, farming, lumber before the war. He really tried to help the men out in that respect. Where in some cases, from what I've heard, is that in some cases, if one of his buddies was too sick to do a shift, in there with their slave labor, my grandfather would jump in and take his shift once in a while. He would do those kinds of things to kind of keep the morale up. But there were so many men that also did that. So it was quite a unit. They all helped each other. But yeah, so as far as maybe let's just go back to some of these pictures. And so here, the next few pictures just kind of show some of the buildings and camps. This is Bowen Road Hospital. So my grandfather actually stayed there for about 6 weeks around August to September 1942 after he had dysentery. So the dysentery had gone through the camps in a big way back that summer. A lot of men went through it, and it was horrible, horrendous. And there was excrement all over the place, and it was just horrible. And my grandfather said, they actually gave him tooth powder to solve this dysentery. And he said, or yeah, it actually did solve it. It actually, or cured him from dysentery. So it was kind of funny, the tooth powder. This is a picture of Shamshipo Camp. I know the pictures aren't that great. Some of these pictures are kind of blurry, but yeah, that's a picture. I think looking off into the harbor. Oh yeah, and it's gonna. Oh, sorry, getting way ahead of myself here. Yeah, there's going to show you North. Yeah, there's North Point Camp. I missed this one. So North Point again, that's where the Japanese landed when they were coming across and onto the island. So this must have been a pre-war picture because there's the buildings are still looking in pretty good shape. So those were kind of the camps that the men stayed in Hong Kong. All right. So now, so around the summertime, my grandfather, he had been talking to two other fellows, two other close friends of his, Lance Ross and Harry Simpson, and they were thinking of an escape. They wanted to escape and maybe try to make their way across China. And there was obstacles. Of course, they were Caucasian, and they would stand out in the Chinese countryside. Not to mention, you'd have to escape across the Japanese-held territories first, and there were very, serious consequences if you were caught. But my grandfather and Harry and Lance Ross, they were keen to pull this off. So they smuggled food in. They smuggled in some medical supplies that they could get their hands on, so water purifiers and sort of thing. And also, I think they even smuggled in a gun. They said was critical when you're going across the Chinese territory. There was lots of bad cats, of course, throughout those countrysides during times of war. So unfortunately, they were hoping to leave in the summer, escape in the summer when the weather was warmest. But then Lance Ross got sick, and then my grandfather got dysentery, and that took them out for many, many weeks. And then by the time October rolled around, when they were starting to get their strength back, there was four other men that actually did escape. They were the Winnipeg Grenadier men, four men, and they actually were captured, and then they were brought back to the camp, and then they were beheaded. So, yeah, very serious consequences. It was horrendous. Um, so at that point, they kind of gave up, the whole plan, because then what the Japanese did after they beheaded those four Winnipeg Grenadiers is they put everyone in groups of five, all the prisoners, and they said if any one escapes, then the rest would die. So, that was kind of the end of any escape, because you really couldn't, put four other men at the mercy of your own actions. So anyway, so then the slave labor began there, where the Japanese got them involved in slave labor at the nearby Kai-Tak airport. So it was laborious. It was backbreaking labor. They were, I think they had to move. There was a big mountain of dirt, and they wanted to extend the airport so that it could handle some heavy bombers. So the men spent days, weeks, months moving dirt and soil, and just and they might get a bun, at lunchtime, maybe half a cup of rice, like just starvation diet. And these guys were worked, a lot of them worked to death. So horrendous conditions. But there came a possible light at the tunnel around December of 42, so about a year after the battle. The Japanese came along and said, hey guys, we want to send a bunch of you back to Japan for some more slave labor, but they explained how beautiful Japan was and all that stuff, blah, blah, blah. So the men were hoping to get picked because of the way the Japanese spoke so eloquently about their homeland. And they said, oh, there's more food there and you would love to go back and so forth. So the men thought it would be a good idea if they get picked to go to Japan on a ship. And my grandfather was one of them that got picked. And over time, throughout the remaining years of the war, there were four ships that would take Canadians to Japan. My grandfather was on the first one, and that was in January and of 1943. And I think there was about 663 Canadians on that ship. And the ship was called the Tatuta Maru. And that's an interesting journey too. And the men got very lucky on this journey. I mean, it was a horrendous journey, but they got lucky in the end, and I'll explain why. But the ship came along. I mean, the men were they received lots of needles, inoculations, and so forth before they had to board the ship. The Japanese were very serious about this. And then on, I think it was January 19th, they left Shamshibo camp. They couldn't leave fast enough. And they actually were whistling and singing a tune. Their hopes were high, but they were leaving Hong Kong forever, and that they thought it would be a better time in Japan, um, better time in the sense of probably better food. And so they boarded the ship. And the thing was with the ship is that it didn't bore any sign that there were prisoners on the ship. And during these times, there's a lot of American submarines in these waters. So the submarines, of course, were looking for any tonnage, any Japanese ships to sink. But there's no signs on this ship. So the men were also very nervous because a month or two or a few months before this, another ship had taken a whole group of British prisoners, I think about 1,800, the Lisbon Maru, and they were taking them to Japan as well, and that actually got torpedoed. And I think half of the men ended up dying, if not more. So, I mean, the men were excited to leave, but they were very nervous being on this ship without any signs. So they go along and they sail back to Japan, and they're way down below in the lowest holds, just sand on the floor, dark, dank. There's not much light at all, no washrooms. You have to use the washrooms where you're sitting or standing. I guess, sorry, you couldn't stand because it was so low that the men couldn't stand up. So you had to actually sit in these holds. So it was just a horrendous stench, as you can imagine, over time. And I don't think they had hardly any food, maybe a little bit of water. And it took about 3 or 4 days for this trip to get to Japan. And so if you can imagine 4 days in these conditions, would have been pretty horrendous. No, and they could not have lights on at any time, because the Japanese did not want any American submarines to see any lights, of course. And so the men land. Luckily, they did not get torpedoed by any American submarines. And the men land in Nagasaki, so on Kyushu Island, which is the southernmost island of Japan. So luckily, they do make it there, but they come out of the holds, and one of the men remembered seeing Japanese soldiers kind of holding their noses, because of the stench as the men came out. So if you can just imagine the stench that would have permeated that area. When the men got out, I believe they were given probably a few buns, just a little bit to kind of keep them going. And then they were put on trains, cattle trains, and sent, they had to stand up, and they were sent 160 kilometers to their new camp. And the new camp, I think officially it's called Omine Camp, but I've always known it as Omine Camp growing up. I just remember that name was always being said. So I'm going to continue. I'll call it Omine, but I think the official pronunciation is Omine. But that was 160 kilometers from Nagasaki. So they took a train, and then they arrive at Omine Camp. And that is now the next part of the journey. And we're now into February 1943. I think I'll just show another few pictures here. All right. Okay, well, there's a picture of the Tatuta Maru. Yeah, it used to be an ocean liner before the war. The Japanese used it between Japan and San Francisco, actually. But then when the war started, it got converted to, troop ship and supply ship type of thing. And ironically, and this is why I say the men were very lucky after this ship, when they landed in Nagasaki, they then filled up this ship full of Japanese troops, and then they were sending them out to Truk, an island way off in the Pacific, for another battle. And 17 days after the men had arrived in Nagasaki, the U.S. grouper submarine actually sank it. So 17 days after the men were dropped off in Nagasaki, this ship got sunk, and I don't think there were any survivors. So the Japanese soldiers never did make it to track, which would have helped the Allied effort as well. Um, just some maps here to show you, to give you some context. So yeah, Nagasaki is in the very bottom here. That's where they landed on Kyushu Island. And then within the island, they took a train from Nagasaki up here to Omine Camp, up here in the north. There's a picture of the actual camp. At least a good chunk of it, a good size of it. Up here in the top corner, those are slag heaps from the coal mines. So they were going to go. They were sent to this camp to work in the coal mines. And here's an aerial view of the camp. So that's the camp here in the circle. And there's the mine head in the green square. And then there are those slag heaps, those big piles of excess material. And so the men, when they began working at this mine, they would walk. I think what they said it was about a half a mile from the camp to the mine head, where they would go into the mine and start their day. I think I'll talk a bit about the Omine camp, and then I'll get into some more pictures. So the camp itself was actually probably a little bit better conditions than the Hong Kong camps. There was, of course, they were going to get into slave labor, and that was still horrendous. That would have been probably worse than the Hong Kong camps, being in the coal mines. And the reason being is that these coal mines had been laying dormant for many years. They were old, rickety old coal mines. So, there was cave-ins, there was crashing cars, the coal cars that would come up and down these tracks. Sometimes, they would lose, they would get uncut and they would come racing down. The men had to jump out of the way, that sort of thing. And it was extremely hot down there, very hot. So a lot of, and it was very dank. The air condition, the airflow was not great. It was horrible. It was kind of a broken down old rickety mine that these men had to go into. And but they had no other choice, of course. And they soon got into shifts. I think there was 3 shifts every day. And yeah, they worked endlessly, like 8 to 10 hour shifts. And when they came back out, they were pretty much covered in black soot. It was coal. So, and it was dangerous work. My grandfather, when he was there, he was on the drill, and the drill was a very tough job. Usually had 2 or 3 guys on the drill, and he actually that would kind of put you right in the coal face, which was very, nasty for you, bad for your lungs, horrible all around. And with the drill, you'd stick it into the face of the coal, you drill it out, and then you stick dynamite in all these different holes, and then you blow it out, and then you collect all the coal and all the other bits and pieces, throw them on the carts, and then they would send up the cars to the top to get unloaded. So that was kind of the gist of it with respect to their coal mining duties. But it was very backbreaking labor. Again, it was awful labor. And again, you had to be very, like my grandfather would say, you had to be very, very sick to not work. He said he actually saw people getting sent on stretchers towards work duties. So, the Japanese did not mess around. You basically had to be on death's door to not work on any given day. Some of the code of conduct, schedules, entertainment, kind of like North Point and Chamshippo camps. But bear in mind, at this point, they were getting progressively weaker. They were losing a lot of weight. So they started off with a little bit of sports back when they were first captured as prisoners. But now they had lost so much weight and their energy levels were way low. They didn't bother with sports so much anymore. They just didn't have the energy. So, they would play cards. Cards were kind of the big thing. But they also had concerts. So there were some entertainers in their groups. Some were professional entertainers. I think there was a few from Britain, because there's also some British prisoners of war as well who were also at this Omine camp. And so once in a while, when they had a little bit of free time, which wasn't often, but they would put on some concerts, very good concerts, so good that even the Japanese guards would attend and enjoy them. So just anything to keep their mind off of the day-to-day, camp life, lonely, be boring, longing for home, and these guys, they didn't have much communication with home. I mean, in the beginning, most of their families didn't know if they were alive or dead. My grandfather, he only was able to send 3 letters back home, and they were just like small postcards, maybe enough room for a paragraph. But at least he could say that he was well, don't worry about me. I'll see you after the war, some of those kinds of words. So a few of his cards did make it home. Um, and, the same kind of diet, it was a starvation diet, basically rice. They also caught rats. I mean, if anything that kind of got into their camp, they would jump on. They set up some traps for rats, and that's what they had to do to survive. And there was one prisoner, I believe, he set up a trap to catch doves, and I think he said 1 or 2 doves in your belly is like a meal at McDonald's. So I mean, they did anything they could to survive, and they would, there was cats, dogs, anything that roamed into their camp. Well, it was fair game. As sad as that sounds, it was fair game. So, they did what they could. There were the Red Cross parcels, but the Japanese hoarded them. So, I think my grandfather said he only got one in his whole 4 years as a prisoner, or 3.5 years as a prisoner. Others might have got 2, but I mean, that was kind of the average. You might have got 1 or 2 throughout the duration. So, which would have helped. I mean, that would have helped for sure. But I mean, the Japanese were hoarding them in warehouses, and they weren't letting the men, get their hands on these Red Cross parcels, food parcels. So, the brutalities as well. Same kind of thing as Sham Chapeau. There was, a lot of brutalities. Some of these guys are very sadistic, and these guards, they were cruel, but there were some that were sympathetic. There were some that were kind, but they were more hostile than not. And I forgot to mention, back in the Hong Kong camps, I'll just mention this little blurb. I mean, the colonel who was in charge of the camp was Colonel Tokunaga, and they called him the Beast of Hong Kong. And he was just horrendous. He would, threaten to behead, nurses and medical staff if too many guys died, and he slapped everyone and all that type of thing. Beatings happened under his watch all the time. And then one of the guards was the Kamloops Kid, and I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard of the Kamloops Kid. But they say a lot of the men said that he was the worst of all the guards in the Hong Kong camps. He often punched, slapped, beat up a lot of the men. I guess supposedly he said he experienced a lot of racism when he was growing up in Canada. Interesting enough, his father was actually served for Canada in World War One. So his father served for Canada, and then his son, who went to Japan for his education when the war broke out, stayed in Japan, and that's how he kind of get into through the Japanese army. After the war, he was put on trial, and he was sent to hang, and his last words were "Banzai." So he did not change. His mind did not change, and he did die by hanging. And the colonel, the Beast of Hong Kong, he was actually supposed to die by hanging, but he was commuted to life imprisonment. So he actually escaped the noose. But now back to Omine brutalities. So a lot of the same types of things. There was, if you didn't salute a guard, if you're walking by a guard, you'd probably get slapped around and beaten up. A lot of men, or the men, they had outside of their accommodations, of their rooms, they had a board, and they had a wooden block, and that wooden block had to be on a nail. There's a nail for every part of the camp. Like there's a nail for the coal mines. There was a nail for the dinner area, that sort of thing, and for the bathroom. And you had to hang your wooden block with your number on it, because the Japanese gave each man a number. You had to hang it wherever you were. So if you had to go to the washroom, well, you had to put your block on the washroom nail. And of course, if you weren't where that block was, they were going to come looking for you and give you a good beating. And I remember my grandfather, he mentioned in one of his interviews that that's what happened to him. He either forgot or misplaced his block on the wrong nail. Well, they gave him a good beating. So things of that nature. They punched and kicked and until somebody would pass out and they'd throw water on the person and he would, you know, become conscious again and beat him up again. Like a lot of these just horrendous things, just for entertainment, a lot of entertainment. They were trying to break the men's spirits, just trying to break them because they just couldn't believe that these men were still continuing to survive with their spirits. So, and they also had a place in the camp called the cage. And if you had done something wrong, fairly serious, they'd put you in this cage for a few days on reduced rations, no blanket. And although it was pretty warm on Cayucho Island, it would also get chilly in the winter months. There would be some snow that would come down. I would think it's similar to Vancouver kind of weather. So, sometimes in Vancouver, it can get chilly and cold. So in the cage, you didn't have blankets or such, and even in their own accommodations, the rooms, there was 8 men to a room. They slept on mats, but there's no heat, so you didn't have when it got chilly, it was pretty cold, and the one lifeline was actually being in the coal mine because it was so hot down there. So in the wintertime, it probably wasn't so bad to be in the mines because of the heat. So let me just now show some more pictures. All right, so here's a picture of one of the rooms at the Omine Camp. So there you can see some of the mats where the men would have had to sleep on, and it was about 8 men to a room. So pretty squished, but I'm sure it was a lot better than the Hong Kong camps. At least these weren't bombed out and missing windows and missing doors and such. There's one of the hallways, and yeah, so long. I'll mention one thing about these hallways. After the war, when my grandfather came home, he built a new house, and he actually didn't put a wooden floor in his house because of this, because he said it would bring back too many memories of hearing the Japanese boots on these wooden floors on the corridors. He said because obviously at times the Japanese would come along and beat up the men for some reason or other, or grab somebody or whatever. So yeah, so these things really, these experiences, left huge scars on the men for a very long time, decades. For some, it never left them. Here's actually, I think I got this from Bill McWhirter, who was a Hong Kong prisoner at Omine with my grandfather. There's that wooden block. You can see that. His number was 37. You can see that on the block. And then they had a tag. So this tag, I believe, went on their miner's hat. So when they went into the mines, they had a hat, they had a light with a battery attached to your belt. They had a cotton jacket and I think cotton shorts and then some rubber soled like sandals, which were horrendous in the coal mines wearing sandals because they were always getting their feet and legs skinned up. But anyway, but this number 37 here, that was a tag that was supposed to go on their hat. And yeah, anyway, so interesting. There's a picture of a lot of the Japanese guards at Omine Camp. I suspect some of the guards would come and go, so this wouldn't have been all of them, but and I suspect I'm not sure when this would have been taken. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure the year in this one. Here's a picture of one of their nights for a concert. So, and in some of the, again, like some of the diaries that I've read, there were some professional entertainers who could really put on a good show. This fellow here that I'm circling with the cursor was actually, it looks like a woman. He was dressed as a woman, and he was actually a Hong Kong fellow, not a Canadian, but a guy who lived in Hong Kong. And they said that he just looked like a woman. Unbelievable, an unbelievable likeliness. But there were some musicians. The guys would somehow scrounge up a few instruments for the concert, and it really took the guys away for an evening just to get their brain out of that camp, right? I mean, anything to get their mind off of what they were going through. This is actually Sidney Skelton. I think I got his name right. He was at Omine Camp, and he actually took, when he left the camp, he ripped off the Japanese flag that was hanging across or above the one of the fences. So anyway, that's some interesting pictures. Let's go back. All right, so the morale at the camp was probably a little better than a lot of other camps, just because the camp that they were at, it was actually what do you call it? It was an old heating system facility. So they actually had quite a bit of hot water. So they actually had 3 huge baths where the men could, have a little bit of hygiene so that they could get into these huge tubs. They would hold about 20 men in each tub, and they were nice and warm. So the guys could be a little bit clean. So this really helped a lot with morale. And they had good leaders there, but I'm sure every camp have their good leaders. And the temperature played a good part too, because it was a very temperate climate. It wasn't too hot, like they weren't stuck in the jungle somewhere like a lot of these camps, and it wasn't too cold. A lot of the camps up in the northern Japanese islands, it was a lot colder, a lot more snow, and these guys just weren't dressed, and the Japanese would not give them much for clothing. So climate really helped morale as well. The worst thing, I mean, there's a lot of worse things about this camp life and just, being away from your family and, slave labor and all that. But a lot of the things, one of the worst things that some of the men would say was the uncertainty. Like you just didn't know what was going to happen day to day. They were always being threatened by the Japanese. So you never knew if you're going to live from one day to the next because of these threats. So the uncertainty of that life was huge for these men, never knowing if you're going to be alive the next day or the next week and so forth. Medical conditions, pretty much the same as the Hong Kong camps. They had everything you could think of. That's what my grandfather used to say. We had everything you could think of. Dysentery, vision blindness, diarrhea, dizzy spells, weakness, bleeding gums, trench feet from wet conditions in the mine, pneumonia, cramps, tuberculosis, sores that wouldn't heal because you're not getting the right nutrients. So you'd have sores endlessly, stomach and digestive issues, foot infections, and I think they called it hot feet. So any little injury would become infected. And again, the guys just didn't have the right equipment in those mines. Their feet were getting skinned up a lot. There was cave-ins all the time. Near the end of the war, I think within a few weeks of the end of the war, there was actually a cave-in that killed 7 Australians. So imagine you've lived through most of the war, and then you die from a cave-in. So just very sad stuff. And I mentioned the communication with the outside world. It just wasn't a whole lot. The odd postcard, my grandfather was able to send out 3, and I think he received, 2 or 3 from his family, from his wife. Now we're going to get to the end part here, the end phase, end game. And so, the war is kind of dragging on now. Now we're in 1943, 1944, 1945. After the Battle of Midway, and that was in June of 42, up until then, the Japanese were pushing and winning. They had a lot of success. They took over a lot of territory. But by Midway battle, midway through 1942, that's when they suffered their first defeat. It was huge. They lost, I think, half of their carriers, if not more, aircraft carriers. So their navy was depleted within one battle. And then their air force, they couldn't replenish their pilots quick enough. Their population wasn't as big as the Americans and the British and the Dutch and so forth. So they just couldn't keep up. Bottom line, the Americans just had much more production capacity, much more resources to draw on. And by 42 and 43, their production was getting into gear, and they were building aircraft carriers. They're pumping out destroyers and battleships, and the Japanese couldn't keep up. So the war had now reversed. So now the Americans are coming back, and now it's more of a defensive war for Japan. They're just trying to keep the Americans at bay. They don't want them coming close to getting close enough to build bases to bomb Japan, because now the Americans had their B-29 Superfortress, which were these amazing, beautiful, heavy bombers. But they had to get close enough to Japan to build um, some airfields to be able to take off, to have that range to bomb Japan, which they would hope would end the war faster. So they began island hopping, taking over islands, pushing the Japanese back towards their homeland. And now we're into 1945. And the men know what's going on. You know, there's always new prisoners coming into the camp. So they're always getting updated on what's happening in the outside world, because of course the Japanese wouldn't let them listen to the radio, although they had confiscated a radio in the camp that they could also listen to bits and pieces of news. So the quandary, now we're near the end of the war, let's say the summer of 45. The big quandary is they know that the Americans are not far. They're getting closer and closer to Japan. So they know that liberation is coming. But they also know, because the Japanese have told the men, that they're going to execute them all once the first American boots hit the beaches of Japan. So, in fact, near the camp, they had built these caves that they would put the men in during air raids, because often the American bombers were now coming over Japan and bombing Japan. And so the men would race in. Once the siren went off, the men would race in into the caves. And the Japanese guards would tell them point blank, you know, one of these days once the Americans land, we're going to put you in these caves. We're going to close the door. We're going to throw in some dynamite. End of story. And then that'll be your grave. And then we're going to, you know, plow over dirt and you'll be there forever, blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, horrendous. I mean, if you can imagine being a prisoner in these caves, being told this, being threatened. So these guys, they were in a quandary. You know, they were excited that the Americans were coming and not far away, but they knew that when their first boots hit the beach, they were all going to be executed. And there were tens of thousands of prisoners of war under the Japanese throughout, you know, Asia and Japan and so forth. And all these men and women were going to be executed. So they decided to create an escape committee. You know, they had nothing else to lose. I mean, they decided they created a clandestine committee, and at this point there were 700 prisoners at this camp, and they were going to go for a mass breakout. They thought, we're just going to, you know, we're going to try to steal. They ended up stealing and stockpiling dynamite from the mines, and they stashed them in different secret places around the camp. And they probably, you know, stocked a bunch of guns away, whatever. But I mean, again, you got to think at this point, a lot of them are 99 pounds. They're very weak, but they got to go for broke. I mean, they've got no other choice. So they've decided to go for a mass breakout whenever the time arrived. And what they were going to do, they were going to just, you know, they were 160 kilometers from Nagasaki, and they were on the southernmost island. So they thought, well, this is the Americans are probably going to land on this island as the starting point for their Japanese invasion. So they were going to head for Nagasaki because of the big port. It was a big port. And so they figured strategically that's what the Americans would probably go for right off the bat. So they figured they were 160 kilometers from Nagasaki and they're going to go for Nagasaki. But they'd have to, in the weakened state, they'd have to travel that distance in enemy territory. You know, they'd stand out like a sore thumb as Caucasians. And, you know, they'd need food, they need water, but it was all that they could do. So they prepared for this. And now comes, well, there was invasion plans were underway that summer, even into the previous spring. On the American side, they were preparing for an invasion. And their invasion was for Kyushu Island, which is where the prisoners were. And this was going to be the biggest invasion in human history. And it was codenamed Olympic. And there was going to be 3 landing areas. And it was going to involve 700,000 people on each side. There was about 700,000 Japanese on this island of military soldiers and such. And it was going to also involve 700,000 American soldiers and personnel. Now, in comparison to D-Day, World War II, or D-Day, right, the biggest invasion ever, there was only 133,000 men involved on D-Day. So this was a massive, massive invasion fleet. And it was going to include 42 aircraft carriers, 24 battleships, 400 destroyers, and about 137,000 vehicles. So, and again, in comparison to D-Day, there was only 7 battleships on D-Day. And this one is going to be 24. So just to kind of compare, this was going to be a massive invasion. And it was planned for November 1st. So the men knew, in the summer, they knew they weren't going to last another winter in that camp. They were all down to 99 pounds, the Canadians. They were just skin and bones at this point, getting weaker by the day. So they knew they weren't going to last another winter. But they also knew that the Americans were close. So yeah, a breakout was the only possibility. Now, a miracle. A miracle happens August 6th. As we know, Hiroshima, atomic bomb, little boy, they called it, hits Hiroshima. But even then, the Japanese were still going to fight it out. They weren't going to surrender. They were still going to fight. And I remember my grandfather saying, next to their camp was a school, and they would see kids, 6, 7, 8 years old, practicing with sharpened bamboo sticks. So even they were going to fight, the Japanese just were not going to surrender. Unbelievable. But then August 9th, Nagasaki bomb gets dropped, called the Fat Man. And now the Japanese, the Emperor Hirohito, now they're starting to think, okay, we can't really keep going with this going on. They can just drop these bombs in all these cities. Nothing's going to be left. So now they've decided that we should work towards a surrender. Now, I'll just mention one little tidbit on that second bombing of Nagasaki. Initially, it was supposed to get dropped on a city called Kokura, and it was only 40 kilometers from Omine. So it was very close to that camp. Now, if it was dropped in Kokura, it wouldn't have impacted the camp. But when the bombs were dropped in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, it had been recorded that glass did break 20 kilometers away. So there were still enough distance away, but 20 kilometers of damage, that doesn't leave much room. So, but they didn't drop the bomb on Kokura because I think it was very cloudy, or there were some fires that were going on away, and all the smoke had come along over Kokura, and they didn't have the navigator couldn't sight the bomb. So that's why, so Nagasaki was the backup city. So the bomb gets dropped. The Japanese come to their senses. They surrender. And at the same time, as they're surrendering, of course, what to do with the prisoners of war? Are they going to still execute them? Well, luckily, General MacArthur, who was running the whole show in the Pacific Theater of War, said, you know what? It's unconditional surrender, and no Japanese can lay a hand on any prisoner, and blah, blah, blah. So this was all written out that the Japanese had to sign off on officially. So that was now sent out to all the camp guards and whoever, the commanders, do not touch the prisoners of war, keep them safe, and all that. So, as bad as the atomic bomb was, yes, it killed quite a few people. It did also save a lot more, because it saved an invasion of Japan, which was going to involve 5 million Americans, and it would have been huge casualties, like 5 million in an invasion. That's huge. And it also saved the lives of about 300,000 plus prisoners of war across Asia. So, it's sad to think that the bomb would kill these many people, but it's going to save this many more. But I guess in war, sometimes that's how the logic plays out. So the men are now free, but it's an interesting situation because they're now still living in Japan. They haven't been, the Americans can't get to their camp for a few weeks. So they have to live in their camp. The Japanese have all left, all the guards, especially the bad ones. They all took off in the middle of the night, and they've immersed themselves into civilian populations and to get away. And so the men are kind of in control of their lives now at the camp. They've taken over the camp, and now food drops are coming down. The Americans have found all the camps, and have these big food drops with the planes. So now they're starting to eat and get their weight back. And it's been said by many men that they gained 30, 40 pounds back within a few weeks. So when they actually arrived home weeks later, they looked normal. And they didn't see, most people, most civilians back home really didn't see what the men, how much they suffered, like physically, appearance wise, because within a few weeks they were able to put all this weight back on from all these food drops. And then, of course, when they actually left the camp, they got back onto a train that took them back to Nagasaki. And then they made their way onto American ships and aircraft carriers that would take them back. I think from my grandfather, when he left, they went from Nagasaki to Okinawa. And Okinawa that's one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific only months before. So some of the men said there were still dead bodies on the beaches and so forth from the battles from previous months. So that was a horrendous battle. And then from Okinawa, they went to Manila, stayed there for a few days, filling out reports, interrogations, that sort of thing. And then on to Hawaii, and then back to Vancouver. And then they took the train across Canada and looking almost normal again with their weight after the Americans treated them like kings and queens, and women as well. And they catered to all their needs, food, medical issues, whatever they wanted, they were given it. So that was nice to see. And yeah, so then my grandfather made it back to PEI. I'm back at the end of 1945. War was over, and now he had to kind of reclaim his life. And he had a son and his wife, and he got back into farming. At that point, the government had I think it was called the VLA Act, where they offered up land to veterans if they wanted the land. And so my grandfather took up farming. He got land from the government and took up farming and got back. He just kind of forgot about the war, got on with living. And they raised 7 more kids after the war. So my father was born before the war. And after the war, 7 more kids came along. And so him and my grandma, they ended up having a nice long life, but there were demons, of course. I mean, there was a lot of scars. My grandfather, he had curvature of the spine from being in those, cramped mines. He had lung issues because of the soot. He was a bit of a smoker too, but I mean, he was in those mines full of soot and everything. So he had lung issues as well. And there's a lot of nightmares. And he had mentioned before that he had nightmares for decades. There was one time when he woke up in the middle of the night, and my grandma heard him, and she woke up and heard him. And when she looked over, she saw him. He had taken a rug in their bedroom and rolled it up as if in like a rifle, and he had it pointing out of their window. And he thought there was Japanese soldiers coming in. So yeah, I think he had these kind of nightmares. But by the time he was in his late 70s, I think he said he didn't really have them anymore, or it didn't affect him much anymore. But there's a few decades of some nasty nightmares. And yeah, a lot of these men suffered in different ways. There was alcoholism for some of these men, mood disorders. Who could they talk to? Would people believe them? They found it hard to talk, open up emotionally with their family and their kids, their wives. That would have been horrendous, having to hold that in for so long. A lot of them could only talk to their priest about this type of stuff. So yeah, it was quite a journey. I mean, I think of all the stresses I might have in my life these days, and it'll never amount to anything remotely close to what these guys suffered just in 4 or 5 years of their lives. And
I think that's true for all of us, Michael. It's amazing what they went through and how the ones who survived did survive. That's a terrific story, and thank you so much for sharing your grandfather's story with us. I'd like to open it up for questions now. If anybody does have any, one, it's not so much a question, but one thing that I found very interesting when you mentioned the first draft of prisoners to be sent from Hong Kong to Japan, that the prisoners actually welcomed that. You know, I'd never heard that before. That's and I guess I can see how that could happen.
That's right. Yeah, it's
You
like
always assume that it's going to be better on the other side. The grass is always greener
that's
on
right.
the other side.
That's
Got a
right.
question here from Jerry. He wants to know, when you did your research, what was the most useful place for you to gather your research about the Omine camp?
Well, it was interesting because when I was doing the research, so when I was about 30, and that would have been back around 2000, the year 2000, that's when I started doing the research. And it took a few years, but back then that was kind of pre-social media, like, even the internet, that was just the internet was just kind of coming on strong then too. So it was way before how communication is done now. But um, I did get in touch. I did a lot of Google searches back then, and I did get in touch with some historians first. First, it was historians. I came across a fellow from Hong Kong who was heavily involved in the research of all that Hong Kong journey. So he helped me a lot. And then I came across some fellows who were heavily into the research of the prisoners, prisoner of wars, and who gave me a lot of information, mainly even just to try to find the Omini camp. I mean, there's like 6 different names for this camp, so there was constant confusion. Like, is this the right name for this camp, and so forth. So this fellow helped me find. He had pictures and so forth, and he helped me find a lot of information on this camp. But then it also came down to some of the veterans who were there. I luckily I just sent out letters to various people and so forth. I came across some names from a diary. I came across some diaries, and there was 3 or 4 key guys that were there with my grandfather. Not necessarily, they didn't necessarily knew my grandfather, but they were at Omini Camp, and a few of them had diaries, and the diaries helped explain a lot of things about that camp. But one fellow, George Coots, who was at that camp, and he was kind of more of a high ranking official there as a prisoner. He helped me a lot. He explained. He sent me probably a dozen letters, and each letter was probably 5 pages long of everything about that camp. So he probably helped me out the most about that camp specifically. His memory was unbelievable. Like, he knew all the details about that camp, even 60 years later. So that's how I kind of gathered my facts about those areas.
Interesting. Now, Muriel wants to know whether you've ever had the opportunity to visit Hong Kong yourself.
I came close once, again, back when I was doing this research. I was kind of excited to go. And there was about 6 or 7 Hong Kong veterans in Calgary, and who I've been visiting and hanging out with from time to time, and great fellas. And they were doing a Hong Kong trip, and I wanted to go, but my wife and I, we had like 3 kids under the age of 4, so we were just too. There's no way that I could leave my wife for a few weeks and enjoy, trotting around Hong Kong. So just because our kids were so young, I just couldn't do it. But so I've never been there, but I am very keen to go at some point. I do want to travel my grandfather's journey in Hong Kong and Japan, just to see all the places that he was at. Yeah.
Well, there's a message here from Martin, who actually lives in Hong Kong and who conducts tours of the battlefield in Hong Kong, along the Chang Gap and areas
Right.
where your grandfather would have been stationed and would have fought. So he thanks you for all the information about Amina Camp and sends you his greetings from Hong Kong. He says it's chilly over there right now. I'm sure that's all relative compared to
Well,
compared to
thank you
here
very
in
much.
Canada.
All right. Well, I hope to
Um,
be there, and hope maybe I'll meet you one of these days. I'm
uh,
game to go. I just gotta figure out some logistics.
I hope so. Any other questions for Michael? Okay. Well, it looks like that's it, Michael. So I want to thank you very much for sharing your grandfather's experiences with us. It's been a very interesting journey from Canada to Hong Kong to Japan and back to Canada again. So thank you very much for taking the time and the effort to research your grandfather's story and for sharing it with us this evening.
Well, thanks, Mike, for having me. I really appreciated it, and
All right.
I'm just happy to talk about it.
And thanks everybody out there. Just a reminder that the session tonight was recorded And also you'll be receiving a survey either when you sign off tonight or within the next 24 hours. So please fill out the survey and give us any ideas you might have for future events. So thanks, everybody, and good night.